As I mentioned earlier, um, as the uh, as the First Crusade began to gear up, as you could say, um, especially when Pope Urban II declared a holy crusade against the Muslims. In particular, it was the feudal nobles and knights who brought a large militia into the Middle East, and they were able to successfully recapture Jerusalem, and they ensured safe passage of Christian pilgrims. However, it was accomplished with a great deal of violence. Um, but nevertheless, Rome was held by Christians and held until the end of the Second Crusade, when Jerusalem was recaptured or reconquered by the Muslim leader Saladin in 1187, which is actually portrayed in the movie Kingdom of Heaven. If any of you have seen that movie, it's actually a pretty interesting and somewhat historically accurate movie. Um, but it is sobering to note that one of the primary obstacles, historically at least, that most Muslims today point to as an objection to receiving Christ is the Crusades, because they were incredibly violent. A large number of people on both sides were killed or enslaved, and it was certainly, looking at it in hindsight at least, it was often a black eye in the side of Christianity, because not only did Christians attack Muslims, but they also attacked other Christian groups, especially in later Crusades. They attacked Eastern Christian strongholds and weakened Christianity in the East, that led really to the fall of Constantinople to the Muslims several hundred years later. Um, but um, there was there was renewal that occurred during this period. Um, there were several monastic movements that began to bring about a sense of renewal. You had the rule of St. Augustine, which emphasized poverty, celibacy, and obedience, but not withdrawal from the world, which was important because many of these monastic movements were not reclusive movements as we might perceive of monastic movements today. They were very evangelistic. You had the Cistercian order that became very attractive to the peasant class, that began to rise in the latter part of the 11th century. Bernard of Clairvaux was probably the most famous leader of this movement. We'll discuss him next week in our lectures, because he was a very charismatic individual, very spirit filled. You had other monastic orders, military orders, that were founded to defend pilgrims and care for the ill. Um, but all of these orders did actually help refocus an emphasis upon Christ and on the presence of the Holy Spirit, and focused on bringing renewal in a period of division, war, and uncertainty. Also during this time, most notably, you had one particular individual especially in Eastern Christianity, that began to refocus upon the emphasis of the Holy Spirit, in particular, the baptism in the Holy Spirit. His name was Simeon the New Theologian. He taught that Christians should experience God directly, and this through a mystical union that he described as the baptism in the Holy Spirit. And this is very significant for renewal theology today. He wrote about it certainly more than any other medieval writer or thinker of his time period. Many of them actually didn't even mention the baptism in the Holy Spirit, but he in particular did, and said it was the path to mystical union with God. According to historical records, Simeon also spoke in tongues and was also used in the charismatic gift of knowledge. Um, there were certainly a number of other significant medieval Christians from this period. I don't have time to mention all of them, but certainly you could mention Anselm of Canterbury, and who mentioned, while he was an early scholastic theologian, who suggested that while reason helps us understand God, it can never replace faith in allowing us to comprehend and experience God. And also Photius, who, at least theologically, many in history point to him as one of the primary people that brought about this theological divide between the Eastern and Western Church. But in reality, I think that's really only because he was on the right side of theological thinking at that time. He really believed, and I think he was right in suggesting that that perhaps the filioque, which again was really a phrase that the Western Church inserted or added into a clause in an ecclesiastical uh, um, meeting that the churches gathered in about the latter part of the 5th century. He suggested it reduced the role of the Holy Spirit to a lesser degree, and um, but because he was somebody committed to the role of the Holy Spirit in the life of the church, and I think that's an important and essential aspect we need to recognize today, because unfortunately, many, or at least some, in the Western Church today don't even know or regard how the Eastern Church helped elevate the role of the Holy Spirit in the broader church experience at this period in time, when there was so much war and division. It's important that many of these leaders held that bar or that level of renewal at this time in history. Well, anyway, that's probably about it for this week. I look forward to your discussion, and we'll see you again next week when we get to talk more about mysticism, monasticism, and scholasticism, and significant renewal that began to take shape at a time in history when the church needed it most. See you next week.